Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
I am most pleased to welcome you to the fourth program in a rather long series that's going to air throughout the summer of dealing with the topic, Confronting Hate, Humanity's Greatest Challenge. On today's program, our topic is police use of force and racial profiling. And we could not be more fortunate than having the guest that we do as to qualifications to address this question. Our guest is a former police officer. He holds a baccalaureate degree from Virginia Commonwealth University. He also has a law degree from the law school at the University of South Carolina, and he has his PhD in criminal justice studies from Arizona State University. Our guest is Dr. Mike Smith. He is an associate professor of criminal justice at Washington State University in the Spokane particular campus, and he is recognized as an expert in policing, law, criminal procedures, and civil liability, and I must add, is a consultant across America. Dr. Smith, welcome to the program. We're so fortunate to have you as part of this series.
Thank you very much.
And I'm very pleased to have our panelists. First of all, Janelle Burke, who is an attorney in the state of Idaho, and next to her is Erna Reinhardt, who is Director of Public Relations at North Idaho College, and Janelle will commence today's questioning.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you here and to talk about this important subject. Our police officers have a very difficult mission, keeping people safe, keeping the community safe, and there are a lot of issues that go into that. Some of them are the use of force when it's appropriate, and another issue, of course, is racial profiling. Let's start with racial profiling, and can you define for us what we mean when we're talking about racial profiling?
That's a good question, and you know, there's no one commonly accepted or sole definition of racial profiling. I think, having said that, though, I think what most people would consider to be racial profiling is some behavior by the police by which they're making a decision based solely on someone's race or ethnicity. And I think there's pretty much a widespread agreement that if, at a minimum, that constitutes racial profiling.
So it would be something where you're looking at a person and making a determination based on that type of a criteria.
Right. It's typically some discretionary decision that the police have to make. When they base that decision only on someone's race or ethnicity, then I think most people would agree that that's racial profiling. Now,
there are other types of profiling, too. Can you define for us and talk a little bit about some of the other kinds of profiling that might go on?
Profiling has been a part of law enforcement for many years, and there are legitimate functions that the police perform that involve profiles, and then there are ones that are not so legitimate. But criminal profiling, for example, is this notion of the police using behavioral cues and intelligence that they may have to develop shorthand identifiers or profiles that may aid them in the performance of their duties, help them to apprehend people who may be about to commit a crime.
Reinhardt.
Mike, tell us a little bit about how you go about training our law enforcement individuals and agencies to deal with this issue.
Racial profiling?
Yes.
It's, as a topic of national concern, it's fairly new. It's been around for a long time, but it's really just entered the public discourse, I think, over the last maybe 3 years. So it's agencies are still beginning to feel their way in terms of how they're going to come to grips with it, how to measure it if it's occurring, and then how to respond to it. So the efforts in terms of training and dealing with it as a social problem, I think, are in their infancy. So there's not a whole lot out there. There are some courses that people offer, some training that people do on what's appropriate, what's legal, what's not legal, what the courts have done. I do some of that training myself, particularly for police executives. But it's a fairly new area, and there's still a lot yet to be done, I think.
I sympathize with the challenge that we have for all areas of law enforcement because of recent developments in the last 2 or 3 years on terrorism, and after 9/11, of course, it's a much greater challenge. Again, I'm building on Ernest's question, and that is something from the experiences we've had recently. There are certain profiles that have been quite accurate about the greatest challenges and dangers, particularly for international terrorism. But yet doing that while not stereotyping an entire community, or the great mistake we made in World War II with the encampment of the Japanese American citizens. So based upon that, Dr. Smith, with all the sympathy that I have and all, how do you give all areas of law enforcement the power to try to address this, and yet at the same time not a green light to deal with total stereotyping?
Well, it's a good question. And the first thing to understand about this topic is that it's a very complex one, and that there are these competing considerations. And in many areas of law enforcement, the public and communities and the courts, for that matter, have to engage in a balancing act. And that's, I think, no more true than here in this area. And your question really sort of hits that on the head there. How do you we want the police to be effective and we want them to be efficient, yet at the same time we want them to protect the constitutional and individual rights that we hold so important here in the United States. And that has been the challenge of policing a democracy for many, many years. And this is just the latest iteration of that, I think. I think that the answer is in the struggle. The answer is in that we are attempting to grapple with it. I think communities and the courts have begun to recognize it as an issue. These questions, forums like this, are beginning to proliferate. The police as an organization, I think nationwide, are beginning to take it seriously, and they're adopting policies, they're training their officers, they're collecting data, and all of these things, I think, help the police to understand the tremendous power that they have, that we've given them in society, and help them to understand that they need to use it judiciously because it's an area of concern.
Certainly, many people I've talked to in the civil rights movement, the NAACP being an example, that in some of our larger cities, in particular African American young men in particular, have faced a very great challenge and seriousness with this issue. As we now see with this other issue that I just alluded to, are there some, to be a little more specific, are there some guidelines being set down for different police departments of saying, rather than trying to address a community, but looking for certain specific behaviors, as you do, like if there's a bank robbery and it says this man that robbed the bank is 6'8" and he's wearing a green hat and so forth, that's a profiling. You're looking for someone 6'8" and so forth, but there's a behavior involved there that you can be much more accurate. So are we beginning to have some specific guidelines saying you don't just go stopping people from a particular community, but if this kind of behavior or these kind of things are happening, then that's where we may draw the line?
Yeah, and keep in mind that there are legal rules that govern when the police can stop, contact, and arrest people. And the police are always subject to having to comply with those rules, and their compliance is overseen both administratively within the organization and also by the courts. And those rules have existed for many, many years.
May I just interrupt to say that does that still come under the guideline of police, you're going to be responsible if there's probable cause involved?
Certainly. The police have to have probable cause to make an arrest. They have to have a lesser legal standard that we call reasonable suspicion in order to make a temporary or a brief detention of someone to investigate their possible involvement in criminal activity. And these are all objective legal standards that the police are held to. Having said that, though, there are many factors that may go into the probable cause calculation. And where the police get into trouble is when race becomes the only or the predominant factor that the police consider when developing the probable cause or the reasonable suspicion that they need to stop and question someone.
So there's a data that are so helpful. And I'll go back to the panel, but if you have a particular police officer and obviously have a record of all their activity, and if this police officer has a history of only stopping people from a certain race or mostly, that's kind of documentation that could cause action toward that police officer.
Yeah, the question that you're asking really is how do we measure it? Right. And more agencies are beginning to collect data on traffic stops or pedestrian stops of citizens. In some cases, there are state statutes that require agencies within a state to collect this sort of data. Many other agencies are doing so voluntarily. The purpose of it is to get an aggregate picture of the agency as a whole, but then also in perhaps a more sophisticated way to look at individual officer behavior and to compare. And it's important that when you're going to make those kinds of comparisons at the individual officer level, as your question raises, that you do it appropriately, and so that officers who work particular areas at particular times of the day should only be compared to officers who work similar areas at similar times of day. And when you have an officer who is an outlier, whose stops appear to be disproportionate to other officers that work that same type of neighborhood and the same time of day, then that's when agencies need to intervene to see, well, perhaps there are reasons why maybe there are legitimate reasons, and maybe there are not. And if there are not, then the officer that needs to be addressed as a management issue.
That's really clear. Thank you so much. Janelle Burke.
In our last round of questions, we talked about racial profiling, and now I'd like to shift over to the use of reasonable force or the use of force by police officers. A lot of that involves a judgment call. And how do you train officers for going out in the field to know how far they should go? And I realize there's some overlap there with the racial profiling as well, but how do you train people to know? What do you say to them?
Well, we start with the law, and the Supreme Court has spoken a couple of times on what the legal standards are that govern the use of force by police, whether it's lethal force or deadly force or non-lethal force. So you start there. That framework is, as you suggest, fairly amorphous. The Supreme Court has said that the police may use the amount of force that's reasonable under the circumstances. That leaves a lot of room for judgment and discretion. What is reasonable? Well, good police departments and those with good training programs have provide their officers with a great deal of training on what is reasonable under what kinds of circumstances, and they have lots of scenarios that they train to. They have policies that have use of force continuums in them. That is, if the suspect does this, then your response ought to be here. If the suspect's resistance escalates, then you should escalate to this level. And there's a whole training curriculum or continuum that measures suspect resistance against officer force, and officers are taught to escalate and de-escalate the amount of force that they use according to the resistance that's being offered by the suspect. So these are the kinds of training issues that professional police departments deal with.
As our society changes, Mike, over time, obviously the issues that you as a police force or as our police personnel has to change with our society. And I'm interested in the area of what you do, which is instruction. Mm-hmm. And how do these issues portray themselves in the academic arena? How do you teach your students how to deal with these things? Are there classes on racial profiling and excessive use of force? Because there must be, on the one hand, we're talking about existing police agencies, but on the other hand, we're talking about we have students that are going through these programs. Sure. And I'm just interested how you deal with the issue in the schools.
Well, I think there's a distinction between training and education, and what the police do for their officers is training. What I do as an academic is education, and so a police department may teach an officer how to use a gun and a nightstick and pepper spray and teach the officer these are the conditions under which you ought to use those devices. What I do is I try to give students a broader picture of sort of the constitutional backdrop to policing in the United States, what police forces in the United States look like from a sociological standpoint, what we as a society ought to be concerned about when it comes to rights and individual freedoms and protections, and the key role that the police play in protecting constitutional rights. So I think we give students the macro view of the police and how the police are situated within our society. Those that go on to become police officers or go into law enforcement later then get the micro view of training. This is how you apply these rules that perhaps you've been taught in an academic environment.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
All of this is so complex, and I'm so pleased that more and more training is going on both in the academic world and in the technical world for police officers. I have lots of sympathy for people that have great challenges. We all have experiences that create some humility for us and realize the complexity of the issue. So my question is evolving out of that idea and concern. Police officers must be better educated than ever before because Supreme Court decisions, starting with the 1960s in particular, of such issues as Miranda and others, there have been many of them, and teaching this area, I can appreciate that complexity. So my question is, do you think that we should try to strive for that time when almost all police officers would have a bachelor's degree in criminal justice? And if we require such extensive training and education, how are we going to budget properly? I'm very critical of the fact that we do not pay well for what we require and demand. So it's kind of open-ended question, but how do you tie that together? How do you fund properly, and then also ask for this kind of training?
Of course, the President's Commission on Law Enforcement in 1968 called for the bachelor's degree as the minimum educational requirement for the police, and that was more than 30 years ago, and we're not there yet. Having said that, though, we've come a long way since 1968, and there are more and more college-educated police officers. There are more and more agencies that are requiring four-year degrees as the entrance requirement. Nowhere near the majority yet. I absolutely think that's the way to go. The college education, the bachelor's degree, gives people a perspective. I hope, at least that's what we claim as educators. It gives them a perspective on life and an ability to critically view issues that not having that degree won't provide you. So, and policing is, as you said, very accurately said, is more challenging today than ever before, far more challenging than ever before. And we ask more of our police officers than we ever have, and that demands a better educated and a person than perhaps we could have gotten away with 30 years ago.
And my other question is, and again, we have a program at our institution too, not of the magnitude of yours, of course, with the baccalaureate degree, and I believe I'm correct that your particular program at the Pullman campus is housed at the Department of Political Science.
Correct.
And then a lot of the other universities, it's either there or in the sociology department, and that pleased me because it's that broad liberal arts approach to the process. But based on that, here we too, and I have the opportunity to participate in that since those students are in political science classes, and that has to do with processing individuals through that process, not just their degree, but the psychological inquiries and others. Does a person really have the temperament to be in this particular field? And so I'd like to get your comments on what you think that should happen. And if we do a really good job in the psychological analysis and academic performance and skills, do we reduce the chance of having the great challenge of racial profiling, for example?
I think we do, and to the extent that students get exposed to issues of liberalism and rights and our political system and so forth, I think that gives them, a broader perspective and helps them to understand their role in society and the great power that we give them that can be used either for good or for ill. And I think education, college education in particular, is invaluable in instilling in them this kind of perspective. And I would agree with you. I think at the end of that process, I hope that we have a student who's then better prepared to go into the law enforcement field than he or she would have been had they not had that 4 years of college experience.
And one more question to get real specific, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but Could you give us some examples or characteristics of a personality that should not go into law enforcement?
Well, yes, I think that people that are impetuous, people that are impatient, people who have an inflated sense of authority, all of these kinds of things don't bode well for the law enforcement personality. And there are many agencies around the country that employ nowadays some fairly sophisticated psychological testing and examination to help identify personality characteristics that are perhaps not well suited for law enforcement. And we have to make sure that those practices continue, and that in fact that they proliferate down to even the smallest agency with 3 or 4 officers. Those agencies can do harm just as well as the ones that have 20 or 30,000 officers.
Thank you. Janelle Burke.
I want to go back to the racial profiling and ask you, what are the dangers of racial profiling? What do studies show are the dangers of using this kind of profiling as opposed to other kinds of profiling that may bear some fruit?
Well, I think the dangers are that it's seen as illegitimate in the eyes of the community. And in the United States, we have a very decentralized policing service. We have over 17,000 police departments in the United States. When you compare that to other Western democracies, it's many, many, many times more than other countries have. And I think that's reflective of our sort of grassroots democracy in the way that it evolved in the United States historically. And so the point of all that is that our police are answerable to their local communities. And when the police are engaging in racial profiling, then they begin to be seen as illegitimate by those local constituencies. And as a result, citizens won't cooperate with the police. They're distrustful of them. The possibility of force goes up then, because people are more likely to resist the police and not see them as legitimate. So there are a whole lot of ramifications that can come from the practice of the illegitimate practice of racial profiling.
And not to mention that an innocent person could be found guilty or could be charged with something and could then have a subsequent record that would be difficult for that person to do things that they might want to do later on.
Sure, there's that concern, absolutely.
Erna Reinhardt.
Being in the public relations field, Mike, I'm real interested in what different institutions and agencies and groups do to define their image in the community. And I think police agencies work so closely with communities, like you said, and this issue can have such huge scars. What do you recommend that agencies do to try to have a positive image with their community?
That's a good question, and let me give a plug to my friend Roger Bragdon, who's the police chief in Spokane, because I've traveled the country and done a lot of work in this area and have seen approaches, both good and bad, and I think what Spokane is doing is probably as good as I've seen anywhere. And Roger Bragdon and his staff have been working with the minority communities in Spokane for several years now on this topic. They have had many, many meetings. They sat down with African American groups in the basement of a church and hammered out an anti-racial profiling policy that became part of the police department's policy manual. They have a citizen advisory group called the Spokane Initiative for Law Enforcement Change that is specifically constituted to help address this topic and has been broken down into several subcommittees that then have met separately. The group has come back together on a number of occasions. I've had the good fortune to be able to attend many of those meetings. You talk to the African American leaders in Spokane and the police department, and they would tell you that at the beginning of the process it was difficult for them to even be in the same room together now. And now they're working together. They respect one another. There are many good feelings that have been generated as a result of this process, and that sort of process is invaluable in establishing those police community relations that you mentioned.
Excellent. And I think once, if that image isn't so great, it takes a lot of work to change that. So that's excellent.
This program goes to many areas, and I'm sure there are women and men who are watching it, particularly young women and men that are wanting to go into this field, criminal justice. And we don't have a lot of time left. We have about 2 minutes, but would you take a little time? This is a great time to pitch a program that's a very important one Washington State University and other places, what in that 4-year program, what should they expect in the field, particularly of the curricula that they would be pursuing?
Well, criminal justice as a discipline is the study of crime and the social and governmental institutions that respond to it. And so we talk about, and we have courses on law and on policy and on the politics behind crime and legislation. We have courses on the police and on courts and corrections and what the various players in the criminal justice system do, how they interact with one another. These are the kinds of things that an undergraduate student, for example, at Washington State University could expect to study and learn about.
And then in addition to all of those within their discipline, like other majors, there's some just liberal arts programs that they have to take in like the natural sciences and
Sure.
English and all that.
Sure.
So the first 2 years would be very heavily
General studies.
and then their junior and senior year they would have this specific program.
That's correct. And at Washington State we offer 2 graduate degrees. We offer both the master's and the PhD in criminal justice. And so for those who wish to pursue their education beyond a bachelor's degree and get a master's degree in criminal justice, we have that available both in Pullman and on the Spokane campus, where I'm the coordinator of that program in Spokane. And then for those that wish to become a researcher, perhaps, they can go on for a PhD in criminal justice.
Like what you're doing in teaching and consulting.
Exactly.
I guess this is a biased statement, but I taught 1 year at Washington State University and was a graduate student there. It's a wonderful institution, and so
I would agree.
You and I would be in great harmony, and we so deeply appreciate Washington State University's involvement, like the other college universities, in this symposium. It's the first time ever that we've got all the colleges together on a week dealing with human rights issues, and it's been wonderful having you on the program, and it's been most informative. And thank you very much, and good luck in your work.
Thanks for having me. I've enjoyed it.
Ladies and gentlemen, this ends the 4th in our series of Confronting Hate, Humanity's Greatest Challenge. We've been so fortunate to have on our program Dr. Mike Smith with Ph.D. and Associate Professor of Criminal Justice at Washington State University. I would like to invite you to be with us again next week at the same time. We're going to continue this series with another guest on Confronting Hate. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.